Welcome back to Reading the Bible Together. We're so glad that you were able to join us this week and that you're still hanging with us through Colossians, learning about how to be a resurrection people as we are going through the rest of the Easter season. And so today we're going to jump in with Christ's victory. That's a good resurrection theme. And that's what we're covering in Colossians today, Christ's victory. And then also kind of contrast that with men's rules. So we left off talking about this secret plan of suffering that brings us to Christ's. So the secret plan of suffering, and that ends up being a key part of Christ's victory, which is what we're, again, talking about today. And what it has to do with our daily lives. And I'm just going to read real quick verse 13 here, 15 of chapter 2, Colossians 2:15. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in it. So, and we're going to get more into what that means in just a little bit. But first, I think it's going to be useful for today's lesson and also for some things we're going to talk about next week, if we just review the landscape, the religious landscape, the philosophical landscape of this time period. So there's these pagan religions where there's multiple gods over various, sometimes overlapping over various aspects of daily life. So there's sort of like a kind of a pick and choose menu kind of attitude that goes with that, but also this danger that you're never really doing enough, both that you're never really serving enough gods, because what if you are doing the dishes one day and you realized you gave your sacrifice to the God of washing the dishes but not rinsing them? I'm being really silly with that, but there's all sorts of ways that you might at some point feel like, oh, you missed something, or a particular God that you feel like you've done enough for, but maybe you didn't quite, and now you're stuck. And there's also, of course, this possibility for exploitation, because the priests and priestesses running the temples are putting greater and greater burdens on their people who are coming and serving at these temples and so on and so forth, and even to the point, because some of these are sexual cults, and so there's all sorts of really horrible exploitation going on as part of this pagan pantheon. And so where are people to turn if that's becoming obvious to them? And there are a bunch of people during this time period, a bunch of ideas floating around involving philosophy. Okay, so there's Gnosticism, where people kind of gather in a group and figure out how to rise to another plane and acquire special knowledge and not kind of engage with the physical world at all. And we've talked about that before. Or there's this idea of just enjoy everything while you can. The gods are very, very far away. They're not really going to mess with us at all. And there's not really any more to life than just whatever you can enjoy, whatever's in front of you at the moment, which is Epicureanism. And then there's Judaism. And so there's some pretty good evidence that there were some people, there's of course lots of devout Jews, the diaspora around the area, and then proselytes, people who had converted to Judaism because they found it attractive. And some of them found it attractive because there's this, aspect of piety to it and serious-mindedness. And of course, we know that Yahweh is a big part of Judaism and draws people to him, and just learning about his sovereignty and his love, that's going to draw people in. So that is the landscape that Jesus comes into and that these early Christians are operating in. And so when people start converting to Christianity, the Jews in the area can make a choice between saying, this is awesome, Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that's in the Old Testament. We're going to go and do all of these things and join this church and be a part of this. Or they can say, no, this is wrong, this is not okay, and we're going to eradicate this. And there were some who were saying, that's fine if you want to be a Christian, but you got to be a good Jew to be a good Christian. And that's who Paul is concerned about here. Paul is concerned when he's talking to the Colossians, he is concerned that someone's going to come in behind him and say, what you're doing is not enough. And he, as far as he's concerned, that puts these people in a category with these priests in these pagan temples that are saying, I don't know, it might not be enough. You might not have a good harvest this year. And so that's what we're fighting against. And so that's a little bit of background before we delve into today's scripture. So again, we're in Colossians 2, and we're going to go back to verse 8. We're going to do verses 8 through 10. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the universe, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have come to fullness in him, who is the head of every ruler and authority. So he's reminding the Colossians that they are following Christ. And there is no, again, tradition or pagan god or empty philosophy sort of covers all the landscape that can equal with the authority of Christ. And he's warning them not to be taken captive. And I'm going to just read that little verse again, that part of verse 8. See to it that no one takes you captive. And so that word captive is kind of a synonym. It's like a word play with the word synagogue. Captive and synagogue would have sounded similar. So he's kind of winking his eye at them a little bit. See that no one takes you captive. And explaining that, and we should remember here, because people have used this to mean something that it doesn't, about Paul being anti-Jewish. Paul isn't anti-Jewish. Paul's like a super Jew. He is very much a practicing, Torah, has the Torah memorized, probably has other big, huge chunks of the Old Testament memorized. He's a scholar and very hugely observant as far as all of his religious practices. But at the same time, he wants them to understand that's not what brings you, that's not what makes you a child of Christ. So he wants to make sure. And we need to look at verse 9 again. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. Basically, Paul is saying, okay, we have to acknowledge this is our true king, right? He is the fullness of deity. He is the one who was promised. So that doesn't, this isn't just another philosophy. He's not just another god in the pantheon for the pagans. And, as far as Judaism goes, again, Paul is very, very Jewish, but he's saying, well, a religion that doesn't acknowledge its own Messiah, if you're trying to have Judaism but not have Christ be the center of it, whether it's because you deny Christ's, messianic qualities altogether, or whether you say, oh yes, Jesus is the Messiah, but you still have to do all these things, or you're not a Christian. He says if Jesus isn't the center of it, what's the point? You're denying your own Messiah. And that makes Judaism just another philosophy as far as he's concerned. So there's a problem still, though. Okay? And the Torah observant Jews would have spotted it at this point. Okay? And possibly some of those behind, the pagan rites, or those with pagan philosophies might have seen it as well. Because part of the reason we seek God and is because, we're built to seek God, and all of these things are an attempt to, in some way, enter his presence. Okay? And we seek God, and we know we can't enter his presence in this state. There's a whole lot that goes on as part of of our interaction with God where that has to be acknowledged. Okay, so a lot of what's happening in pagan temples or what's being addressed in the Torah is our unworthiness to come before God in the state that we're in. And Paul answers this in the language of the Torah, because that's who he's really focused on more than the other groups. He answers this in the language of the Torah, and he's using this language to talk about Christ to prevent that same language from being abused by outside groups later. So he's gonna address this church in the language of the Torah, and he's going to talk about things like, circumcision and all of that, because he knows that there's going to be somebody showing up after him at this church in Galatia Galatians, at Colossae. Okay, he's going to be using this same language they're going to be using this same language to try and lead people astray. So let's look at verses 11 through 14. In him also you were circumcised with a spiritual circumcision, by putting off the body of flesh in the circumcision of Christ. When you were buried with him in baptism, you were also raised with him through faith in the power of God, who raised you from the dead. And when you were dead in trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive together with him when he forgave us all our trespasses, erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands. He set this aside, nailing it to the cross. Okay? So he's just going ahead and addressing issues that he thinks are going to be a problem, because in Galatia, people came in behind him, and he's afraid the same thing is going to happen to the Colossians. And so he's saying, okay, heads up, people, be prepared for this and don't be sucked in by it. We need to read that last verse again. Erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands, he set this aside, nailing it to the cross. Okay, so just like the Torah has a bunch of ancient baggage that we sometimes have to unpack to fully understand it, the cross does as well. And we feel like we have a very good knowledge of the cross because we just spent lots of time talking about the cross and the crucifixion during the Lenten and Easter season. But we need to kind of understand it in the political context of Rome. Okay? So in ancient Rome, there was no Twitter. That actually sounds kind of nice. The rest of it's not going to sound nice, though. There's some really bad things going on in ancient Rome. But anyway, there was no Twitter. There was no CNN or Fox News. There was not even any newspapers, okay? So the way that news was passed was completely different. And so if you were part of an army that was like a victorious army that like you went away and you fought in some battle and you're coming back home, your way of announcing your victory in that battle is by this military procession. So in ancient Rome, if you defeated your enemies, you would march back into town with this glorious procession, your army all, dressed up and spiffy looking. And part of how you would prove, because you can't just come back and say, hey, we won, yay. Really? How can we tell? No, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. No, you had to prove that you had won. So you would drag all of the stuff, all of the spoils of war, including the people that you had enslaved behind you. And at the very end of that procession is going to be the king that you had defeated. Okay? And so the king is at the end of the procession, and of course everybody else is looking really, spiffy. He's gonna be stripped of all of his armor and his royal finery and made to look ridiculous. That's part of how you dehumanize your enemies. And so this is, and then you march into town, and the king is publicly executed in the square in the middle of town. This is why Pilate chose to write King of the Jews over the top of Jesus while he's crucified, and this is why the Pharisees and leaders were so upset that he did that, was because they're basically saying, okay, we've just defeated your king. So this is Paul is going to flip this image on its head, right? He's taking this idea. So let's go back to verse 14 again, and then let's read on to 15. Erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands, he set this aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in it. So he's basically saying, okay, well, they thought that they got Jesus, right? And that's, they crucify him. It says King of the Jews on the cross, but that ends up, because he rose from the dead then, he's turned that into his enthronement. His victory, his resurrection is his victory over all those people who were trying to have the victory over him. And so this is this completely kind of just turning everything on its head moment. And so we got to decide, well, we don't have to decide. We got to see in verses 16 and 17 what that victory means for the Colossians and, for us. So therefore, this is 16 and 17. Therefore, do not let anyone condemn you in matters of food and drink, or of observing festivals and new moons or Sabbaths. These are only a shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So, the rulers, the rules, right? The rules about the Sabbath, the rules about new moon festivals, the rules about circumcision were shadows of the king, of something that's actually solid. And Jesus is the actual solid something that all of this was supposed to point towards, right? The Sabbath, for instance, is the symbol of God's resting on the seventh day, and of paradise, and of releasing people from their slavery. And, as some of us who have read the Gospels know that, Jesus sort of accused the Jewish rulers of kind of using the Sabbath to enslave people when it was supposed to be a day of liberation. So those are the rules, but they're meant to point towards Jesus. So you can't, say, okay, ignore Jesus. That's nice that he's there and all, but let's make sure we do these rules. That's not going to work. And then he continues, do not let anyone disqualify you, insisting on self-abasement and worship of angels, dwelling on visions, puffed up without cause by a human way of thinking, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and held together by its ligaments and sinews, grows with a growth that is from God. So, we're spending a lot of time this month on the idea of prayer, and there's lots of suggestions being given about how to pray, but no one is telling anyone, if you don't pray in this exact way, at this exact time, using this exact magic formula, you're not really a Christian, right? That's not what's happening. And this is something that Paul is saying, okay, this can't be. We can't be sucked into these complex spiritual rituals that are imposed by another human, and that only acknowledges one sort of spiritual experience. Now, at the same time, Paul is not saying, so you don't have to pray. Like he wants people to pray. He wants, it's important that we find a way of praying that suits you. But so that idea that we're kind of downplaying other people's spiritual experiences, that's not, Paul says, that's not being resurrection people. Now, it's also important to realize that even though Paul's saying, these rules about do not touch and do not taste and all that, food and drink, Sabbaths and new moons, even though he's saying, okay, don't let people, enslave you with these rules, he also isn't saying, so do whatever you want, okay? If you read all of Paul, you'll see lots of places where he doesn't say, do whatever you want. And we're going to spend a lot of time next week on things we should do and things we shouldn't do. But just for right now, let's look first at verses 6 and 7. Okay, this is chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. As you therefore have received Christ Jesus, the Lord, continue to live your lives in him, rooted and built up in him and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. Because, all throughout this book, there's all of this idea of how powerful Jesus is and how much he's done for us and the gratitude that needs to pour out from us because of that. That's a big foundation of the book of Colossians. So what Paul is saying is, you're not living your life, by a certain set of rules to please a person. You're living your life out of thankfulness to Jesus for his forgiveness. In fact, if we can remind ourselves, we read verse 13 earlier, but I'm going to read it again. And when you were dead in your trespasses and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive together with him when he forgave us all our trespasses. So, God has forgiven you, and you're going to live out of great gratitude for that forgiveness. Not just keep on doing stuff you shouldn't do. And again, we're going to talk more about the nitty-gritty of that next week. And then, once again, not be taken in. Okay, so we're not doing whatever we want, but we're also not going to be taken in. We're going to review verse 8 real quick. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the universe, and not according to Christ. Okay? And so we're not going to be taken in. We're not going to be ruled over, right? Verse 18, do not let anybody disqualify you, insisting on self-abasement and worship of angels, dwelling on visions, puffed up without cause by a human way of thinking. So this also means, if we're not going to be taken in, we're not going to be ruled over. It means we're also not going to rule over others. We're not going to turn to people and say, okay, you're praying wrong. So that's, something that we really need to prayerfully think about. And we need to talk about what that looks like next week, a little bit more, the nitty-gritty of it. But for now, I just want us to think about this. Read a little piece of something here. Okay? So Paul is addressing the philosophies of the day, right? He's looking at the Colossians and he's saying, here's the dangers that I see around you that are getting ready to pull you away from your true king, okay? And so what we may want to think about as we look through our Bibles and read how we are to behave and read how Paul addresses his own time period, what are the philosophies that we see in our world today that are dangerous? And how do we need to help each other? How do we need to articulate clearly what Christ would have us to be and do? And how would Paul address these? How would he use the gifts that God gave him to speak life into our culture today? So I hope you'll join us next week, and thank you very much.